A silent girl comes to a new school and no one knows anything about her past. Her calmness provokes the school queen into a war where fear dictates the rules. But the stronger the pressure, the louder the silence of someone who is not afraid to be themselves sounds. And one day everything around changes, without a shout, without a blow, with one decision to stand. The morning in Brooklyn was gray and chilly, typical of early fall. It hadn't started raining yet, but the sky hung low with that heaviness that makes every breath seem labored. Outside the campus of Redwood High, a large red brick building with peeling columns at the entrance, students were slowly gathering. Some were laughing, some were already scrolling through their phones, some were running up to friends and hugging them as they passed. Inside, there was the familiar energy of teenage restlessness, held together by repetitive routine, bells, schedules, hallways, glances. Against the backdrop of this noisy crowd, she appeared almost unnoticed. Alia Moore. A gray sweatshirt, the hood pulled down over her head, a black backpack with no patches, thick jeans, old sneakers. She was neither fashionable nor weird, just nobody's. Not a single detail of her appearance begged for attention, but that was her strength. She stopped on the sidewalk, looked around the building. She looked up, took a deep breath like she was about to dive. Then she crossed the street and went through the gate. Aunt Mary, her father's younger sister, had met her at the train station 3 days ago. A little tense, her eyes haggard, but genuinely caring. The house smelled clean but empty. Mary had been working most of the day, and her son, a senior in high school, had already moved in with his girlfriend. So Alia had time. Lots of time. To be quiet. To think. To not feel. There was nothing extra in her luggage. Just clothes, a notebook, a photo of her mother, her father's old gloves, and a letter. Or rather, a copy of it. Her father burned the real letter himself right before he left. He said, if you want to escape from pain, be silent. There is more power in silence than in any scream. He knew what he was talking about. He was a fighter. Not just in the ring, but in life. When Alia entered the school, she didn't look around or at faces. She just went to the schedule board. Finding her name was all she needed. Finding and knowing where to sit. Where to stand. Where to be. So that no one would have any questions. But questions arose. Almost immediately. New, the voice was confident with a polished false friendliness. Alia turned slowly. In front of her stood a white girl with well-groomed light brown hair, a branded school jacket, and 3 friends behind her. Her smile was like a taut string, beautiful, ringing, and cold. I'm Savannah. If you don't want to drown here, you better smile. People like it when you smile. Alia looked at her silently. Or are you mute? Snorted one of her friends. Or she just thinks she's too cool for us, added the second. Alia looked down, nodded, and walked away. Not because she was afraid. She just didn't want her first meeting with a new school to be noisy. But silence became her signature. She didn't raise her hand in class. She didn't talk back. She answered briefly, to the point. She didn't look away, but she didn't look for anyone's eyes either. Some teachers tried to stir her up. Alia, maybe you can tell us how the classes went in Atlanta? The same as here. The class laughed. The teachers winced. Alia was silent. By lunchtime, word of the stone-faced new girl had spread through the halls. Some thought she was weird. Some thought she was dangerous. Some thought she was interesting. Savannah's interest was undiminished. She was irritated by this girl in gray who didn't fit in. Who didn't ask for approval. Who wasn't afraid of being alone. Savannah was power. Silent but undeniable. When she spoke, they listened. When she whispered, they followed. Her power was built on fear and charm. But mostly on control. And Alia did not accept this control. After classes, when the corridors were empty, Alia approached the gym. It was open. No one inside. Only the quiet creaking of the suspension and the smell of rubber. She took off her backpack, put on old gloves, and stood by the bag. Not to fight. To remember. Rhythm, inhale. Block. Turn the body. Point of support. She didn't hit hard. But she hit accurately. Every move was learned. Perfected. At that moment, the door opened. Someone was watching. She knew. But she didn't turn around. She just kept going. Afterwards, I wiped my hands, put everything back in place, got dressed, left. The next day, there was a note by her locker. Be careful, Atlanta. This is not a gym. She folded it in half and threw it away. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew it was just beginning. In a new school, in a new city with new enemies, she was not a heroine, not a rebel, not a victim. She was herself. And that was the most terrible thing for those who considered themselves the center of the world. Her weapon is silence. Her armor is endurance. Her rule is not to give in. Savannah Wells had never met anyone like Alia Moore. She knew how to control people, with a word, a glance, a well-timed whisper. In her world, everything worked like a well-oiled machine. Friendships were strategic, enemies were pre-designated, teachers were charmed, classmates were obedient. She could crush anyone she didn't like with a taunt, a smile in the right place. But Alia was different, and it drove Savannah crazy. She didn't speak. She wasn't rude. She didn't answer. She just looked quietly, calmly. And in that silent gaze there was something elusively frightening. Savannah wasn't used to the lack of reaction. Her rules were either obeyed or rebelled against. But Alia did neither. She existed as if outside the system, and in doing so, she destroyed it. For the second week, Alia walked around the school like a shadow with a spine of steel. She didn't seek company, but she didn't avoid people either. She just didn't approach. She didn't join in. She didn't play. In the school cafeteria, she would sit by the window alone. Sometimes she would take a book. More often she would just eat in silence, looking out at the street, as if there was another world beyond the glass, much more important than what was happening inside. Savannah watched, from a distance, but carefully. Does she not talk at all? Jaylene, one of her closest friends, asked one day. Maybe she's mute? Noelle chuckled. No, Savannah said, slowly stirring her lemonade. She's not mute. She just wants to show that she's bigger than this, that she doesn't need us. Then humiliate her like everyone else, Noelle snapped. No, Savannah narrowed her eyes. That won't work. She's not afraid. And that, my dears, is what makes the game interesting. During recess, someone smeared chewing gum on Alia's locker and wrote in marker, "Empty mask." Alia, seeing this, simply took some napkins out of her pocket, erased the inscription and calmly opened the closet. No comment, no surprise, as if all this had happened before. The students watching this looked at each other, some with mockery, others with questions. Some felt awkward for the first time. Then there was the story with biology. Savannah had arranged with the teacher in advance to move Alia to the back row, where either the truants or the invisibles sat. The signal was clear. You are not with us. You are out of the game. Alia didn't object. She sat down, opened her notebook and leaned over it, as if all this had nothing to do with her. But the teacher noticed. Her answers were precise. Her notes were neat. Her work was the first to be completed. In her next gym class, Savannah went further. Maybe you'll show me what you can do, Silence? She shouted in the locker room. Or do you only talk to the punching bag? A few girls laughed, but not all. Some just looked at each other. Something was starting to crackle. When the teacher suggested a sparring game, pushing on a balance platform, Savannah, without waiting for a choice, volunteered to fight against Alia. Alia stood on the platform silently. Try not to fall on the first push, Savannah whispered, and she pushed. Alia leaned back. Remain steady, looked, and returned the push, not strong, not aggressive. Just smooth, balanced. Savannah lost her balance and fell. Not painfully, but in front of everyone. Alia stood on the platform. Straight, silently. Savannah stood up, her face burning. Next time, don't hold back, she said through gritted teeth. Alia bowed her head slightly. I never waste my energy. Rachel Singh watched with bated breath. Small, fragile, wearing glasses, she was the one who was used to being in the shadows. But she was the first one to approach Alia after class. Hi, I'm Rachel. I just wanted to say you're awesome. Alia nodded. Thank you. How do you stand all this? I would have already run away. Or screamed. Or, I don't know. Alia looked at her, there was something surprisingly calm in her eyes. To shout is to accept their rules. And I play my game. By the end of the second week, the atmosphere at school began to change. It was subtle, not fast. But it was definite. People began to look at Alia differently. They no longer saw her as the new girl. They began to fear her, not like Savannah, not in a fake way, but for real. Because Savannah had menace wrapped in popularity. And Alia had a quiet confidence that you can't buy or copy. Savannah felt her crown begin to crack. Her gaze is not as sharp. Her orders not as complied with. Some of her friends began to ask questions. Why was she fixated on one girl? Why couldn't she just let go? And then she decided, enough hints. Enough subtle games. It's time to make a show out of this. You want to be the center of attention, Atlanta, she said out loud in the hallway. Tomorrow after school? The playground behind the gym. Just you and me, really? The crowd froze. Someone gasped. Someone cheered. Someone filmed. Alia? She looked at her. Not with fear. Not with defiance. With absolute peace. As you wish, she replied. And she walked away. Savannah didn't even understand why the simple agreement suddenly made her feel uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. The area behind the Redwood High Gym never seemed like a special place. During the day, it was used for pickup games, shooting hoops, and lounging around during recess. But in the evening, as the sun set and the colors deepened, it became an arena, one where rumors were born, reputations were shattered, and school rules were established. The day after the call, Savannah Wells stood at her second-story window watching the students trickle out. The crowd hadn't yet formed, but the air was already charged with anticipation. Phones were at hand, cameras were charged, eyes were full of anticipation. Even those who usually shied away from controversy couldn't resist the chance to see the outcome of this strange, silent feud. Savannah stood up straight. Flawless makeup. Rings on her fingers. A denim jacket with her initials on it. She was going to be the center of attention again today. But something was itching inside her. Uncertainty? Doubt? She brushed it off. It was just excitement. Same old, same old. Is she definitely coming? Noelle asked, trying to pass off confidence's interest. She will come, Savannah replied. She can't ignore the challenge. In front of the whole school. And yet, as they walked down the hallway, with every step Savannah felt her confidence not rise, but settle somewhere in her stomach. Aaliyah arrived. Exactly at the appointed time. In the same gray sneakers, with a regular backpack and a hood slightly lowered on her forehead. Not a trace of tension. Not the slightest sign of anxiety. The crowd parted as she walked toward the center of the court. Not because they were afraid of her. Because they sensed she wasn't there to play. She stood up, put her backpack on the ground, and straightened up. Savannah, flanked by two boys, Jay and Noah, arrived a little later with belated importance, like a star appearing when the audience is already waiting. I didn't think you'd actually come, she chuckled. Aaliyah didn't answer. She just looked. You wanted to show how special you were all this time, didn't you? Sitting alone, silent, pretending to be above all this. Do you think we'll be scared by your gaze? Silence. Savannah stepped closer. Well, come on. Now let's see what you're capable of. She nodded at Noah. He took a step forward, hesitant but demonstrative. Tension hung in the air. Aaliyah didn't even move. But when Noah extended his arm forward, she caught it deftly. In one smooth motion, she twisted his elbow, turned, and brought him down onto his knee. No pain. No harshness. But with precision. The crowd gasped. The cameras shook. Jay lunged forward, pushing the students aside. Too late. As he approached, Aaliyah stepped to the side and he lost his balance. He fell to the ground. And here they are, both on the ground. And she is still standing. Straight. Breathing calmly. Not even sweating. Savannah froze. Things weren't going according to plan. Everyone was looking at her. You think you won? She blurted out, trying to save face. Aaliyah looked at her. Not angrily. Not arrogantly. Just straight. I didn't come to win. Then why? Savannah gasped. What do you want? So that you would shut up. These words sounded so simple that someone in the crowd burst out laughing in surprise. Savannah took a step closer. You're no better than me. You're just a mute girl who's had a bad year. You think that gives you the right to. I don't think. I know, interrupted Aaliyah. What do you know? That you're loud because you're afraid. That you're angry because you're fragile. And that all you command is fear. And I'm not afraid of you. The crowd froze. The phones shook in their hands. Savannah tried to say something. The words wouldn't come out. She jerked as if she wanted to hit. But her hand hung in the air. And trembled. Hit me if you want, said Aaliyah. Then everyone will see who you are. The hand dropped. But not forward. But down. Without action. Without force. You're no better, Savannah whispered, no longer confidently, but breaking down. I wasn't trying to be better. I just came to remind you that you don't control everything here. And that you can give up fear. And she walked away. Without looking back. Rachel watched her go. Cam, who had been standing off to the side with his camera, slowly lowered the lens. He didn't want to take any more pictures. It was no longer a spectacle. It was a change. The next day, the school greeted her with silence. People were talking quietly. Savannah came to class, as always, smartly dressed, confidently. But no one looked at her with the same delight. Someone avoided looking. Someone smiled at others. Aaliyah was not greeted with applause. No one clapped, but no one touched her either. And no one tried to whisper behind her back anymore. She just sat down by the window, opened her notebook, started writing. Her war was over. Without victory. Without losses. Simply with the return of the right to be herself. After the incident on the sports ground, the school seemed to shift off its axis. Everything remained in place, the same walls, the same bells, the same schedules, but the atmosphere, barely perceptible and previously elusive, had changed. Students who had previously laughed loudly now spoke more quietly. Those who had previously walked down the corridor without noticing others began to look around. It was as if the very fabric of the school world, long stretched and bent under the weight of familiar authority, had cracked, and something new was breaking through these cracks. Savannah Wells sat in the front row of history class, and for the first time in a long time she felt no admiring glances. The teacher wrote on the board, someone flipped pages, someone wrote. But not a single whisper was about her. Not a single glance lingered longer than usual. Even her own shadow on the desk seemed smaller. She tried to act like she always did. The usual tilt of her head, the usual posture, the raised eyebrow. But what had worked effortlessly before now seemed like theater staged before an empty room. She suddenly realized that she didn't know how to be just a student. Without influence. Without power. Without triumph. After class, she walked down the hallway with Noelle and Jaylene, but the conversation didn't go well. "Are you going to practice today?" Jaylene asked. "Why?" Savannah shrugged. "There's nothing to do." "Well, it's just that you usually." "I said it's not interesting," Savannah interrupted. The friends glanced at each other. Something new flashed in their eyes. Mild irritation. Or weariness. They were not used to Savannah without a flag in her hands. And now she stood alone, without a goal and without a battle, like a general without a war. Meanwhile, Aaliyah sat in the back row of English class, as always. No one approached. No one asked questions. But now her silence was not alienation, but respect. Rachel Singh, the quiet girl with the watchful eyes, sat down next to her during recess. "May I?" she asked, pointing to the seat next to her. Aaliyah nodded. "Are you okay?" Rachel asked timidly. "And you?" Aaliyah answered calmly. "Better than before," she admitted. People have started listening. Today, when an older guy started picking on a new kid in the cafeteria, someone stood up for him. That never happened before. No one would have risked it. Aaliyah didn't say anything. She just lifted the corner of her lips slightly. Almost a smile. That was enough. Teachers felt the changes too. Mrs. Howard, the literature teacher, lingered at the door after class as Aaliyah walked past. "Miss Moore," she called quietly. Aaliyah stopped. "I just wanted to say, I see how you carry yourself. Reserved. Dignified. It commands respect." "Thank you," Aaliyah answered quietly. "If you ever want to talk, not necessarily about lessons, I'll be here." Aaliyah nodded. She left, but something strange responded inside her. Not anxiety. Not protection. But trust. She was not ready for it. But it appeared. After school, Savannah went out into the backyard. She hadn't planned to go there. Her feet just carried her to the playground. That one. She stopped at a bench, sat down, and ran her hand over the coolwood. Everything here was as before. Only not her. Her gaze slid to the corner where Jay and Noah had stood that day. She remembered Jay falling, Noah twisting his arm, the crowd gasping. And how Aaliyah stood there, not a winner, not a warrior. Just a person who knew her worth. Savannah suddenly realized that everything she had built was built on fear. And fear crumbles as soon as someone chooses not to be afraid. And in this choice was all of Aaliyah's strength. A couple of days later, in the art room, Cam, the guy with the camera who always kept to himself, approached Aaliyah. He silently handed her the photo. In the picture, she is standing against a brick wall, half-turned, at the moment when the sun falls on her shoulder. In her eyes, there is calm. And inner strength. "You didn't know I filmed you," he said. "But I think you should see this." Aaliyah looked at the photograph for a long time. Then at him. "Thank you." He didn't expect a smile or a conversation. He just nodded and left. She put the photo in her backpack. On Friday morning, a post from Rachel appeared in the school group. "The strong don't always need to talk. Sometimes it's enough to stand still when everyone else is running. Thanks for reminding me." There are dozens of likes under the post. Comments. Even those who hadn't previously paid attention to what was happening began to discuss that maybe it's not necessary to be loud to be strong. Savannah turned off her phone when she saw the post. Not because she was angry, but because she felt ashamed. Real, hard shame, not in front of a crowd. In front of herself. She walked down the corridor, head down. People were looking, but no longer with admiration. With curiosity. Restrained. And without fear. She found Aaliyah at her locker. She stopped. Stood there. More. Aaliyah closed the door and turned around. Silently. I don't know what to say. And I'm not sure you want to hear it. Aaliyah didn't move. But I saw what you had become. And what I seem to be. Maybe one day you will forgive me. Maybe not. But I had to tell you. Aaliyah nodded. Not with approval. Not with hostility. Just as a fact. And that was enough. Savannah left. Quieter than when she came. Aaliyah stayed. Still the same. Only now not alone. The last week of term was drawing to a close. The winter sun rose late and went down early, casting long, viscous shadows in the school hallways. Redwood High looked familiar again, but to those who knew how to look, much had changed. The hum of voices had become softer. Laughter was less for show. People were learning to listen to each other, if only unconsciously. And in this change, though not loud, stood the figure with whom it all began. Aaliyah Moore was still the first one to arrive. She would sit by the classroom window, put her hands on the table, and just wait for the bell to ring. She wasn't trying to be popular. She wasn't looking for attention. But she wasn't invisible anymore. Now they nodded in her direction. They let her pass in the corridor. They did not touch her. And this was not out of fear, but out of respect. Silent, firm, like herself. On Monday morning, before English class, Rachel brought her a book. Old cover, worn pages. This is a collection of essays about people who changed their environment. Not through revolutions, but through presence. Aaliyah took the book in her hands and turned it over in her palms. Thank you. I just thought you might relate to it. Aaliyah nodded. I'll read it. And there was a dialogue in this. A real one. Something had shifted in the staff room, too. Mrs. Howard, the literature teacher, was discussing a new school project with her colleagues, Your Story. The idea was for each senior to tell their truth about who they had become, why, and what inside them was important for others to hear. I'd suggest more, she said. She has a voice. Even if she rarely uses it. She's difficult, Mr. Kaufman said. But you know that's what's important about her. That same day, after lunch, Aaliyah headed to the gym. Not to work out. Just to be there. To feel the emptiness of the room, the cool leather of the benches, the smell of rubber and dust, and, most importantly, the silence. She sat down on the edge of the carpet, took off her sneakers, stretched out her legs, and leaned against the wall. A couple of minutes later, footsteps were heard. It was Cam, with a camera on his chest and a slight hesitation in his movements. Hello, he said. Hello. Can? She nodded, pointing to the next bench. I thought, he began and fell silent. What? I thought you wanted to be alone. I've been alone a lot, she replied. Not necessarily now. He nodded. He thought. Do you want to see? He showed the camera screen. There were several frames from that evening. Not the fight. Not the moment of the fall. But her look. Calm. Face without makeup. The truth. I want to do an exhibition in the school gallery. Call it Invisible. Can I include you? Aaliyah looked at him. For a long time. Okay. But just sign A. He smiled. Respect for anonymity? No. Let everyone decide for themselves who I am. Meanwhile, Savannah was gone. Not physically. She was still there. But her light was no longer shining in my eyes. She had stopped dictating. She had stopped laughing loudly. She had become quieter, more modest, more attentive. During recess, she approached Mrs. Howard. Can I participate in your story? Certainly. It's just that I don't know where to start. Start with the truth, Savannah. And you'll have somewhere to go. The class, which had previously only heard lectures, now listened to more than just teachers. In literature class, students read excerpts from their own texts. Rachel talked about the fear of being invisible. Cam talked about how photography became a way to speak. One guy admitted that he had never realized how often he was silent, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was afraid of being laughed at. When it was Aaliyah's turn, she rose from her seat. Not in a hurry. Slowly. I didn't prepare a speech, she began. Because I haven't said anything at all for a long time. The class froze. I was taught to control myself. To be the silence in the noise. Not because it is a weakness, but because it is a choice. But sometimes to change something you need to do more than just stand there. You need to be seen. Heard. She fell silent. Then she added, and sometimes it only takes one person who isn't afraid to be themselves. For others to start remembering who they were before their fear. There was no applause. But the silence was absolute. Respectful. On the day of the invisible exhibition, the school gallery was full. On the walls were faces. No pose. No filter. Real. Among them is a portrait of Alia. With the signature A. Some did. Some didn't. And that was the power. After the exhibition, Rachel approached Alia. You changed us. No, Alia replied. I just reminded you that you can be yourself. The last scene is spring. The area behind the school. The same concrete. The same world. Alia sits on a bench. Rachel and Cam are nearby. The school is buzzing behind them. Laughter, conversations, life. She looks at the sun, which shines calmly and softly as if she knows fear no longer rules here. There is now choice. And she did hers. Silently. Confidently. Forever.